All right, I think we'll get started as people are still streaming in. Welcome to our webinar series of the CADRE platform. So for those who are not familiar, CADRE is a collaborative data sharing platform in the cloud that we're building for a group of universities here in the Midwest. And you can check out our beta launch, which happened a couple of weeks ago. We completely switched to new data engines. The user data will now be persistent, so feel free to start exploring our platform. Another update is that we'll be continuously rolling out new features, so we welcome any feedbacks. The current beta version is definitely not mature yet, so we need your help. You can reach us through multiple channels, our website, our Twitter, email, and I think the recording is already available for the beta launch demo. Here's a list of our consortium of our supporting institutions. And also want to, so if you're coming from an institution who hasn't tried CADRE yet, check it out. Here's a free trial version. And we'll acknowledge Institute for Museum and Library Services for their funding support, Web of Science and Microsoft Research for their data support. And I'm going to launch a short demo. Oops, I guess I clicked the wrong thing. Stephanie, can you help me launch the survey?
Sure. I just launched it.
There you go. Yeah. Take a few seconds to finish for us to collect statistics. So a lot has happened this year. We launched the alpha version, beta version. Our fellow team has been presenting back in September. Samuel and their team already presented on a different topic, a related topic. I think biological journals in particular. Samuel today will be presenting a more general analysis on a bigger data set. In October, Adam presented our group's work. Yeah, this is so. The title here, as Samuel suggested, is slightly different from what he's going to be presenting today. It's more general than just mathematics and other sciences. I think it covers all sciences, for all papers in the Web of Science. It's one of the few studies that I saw that covers the whole range of data set of Web of Science. So very exciting, and lots of slides to go through for him, I think. And I think in a couple of weeks, we'll have our last fellow presentation from our team, from Purdue University. So here's the links you can check out for everything happens on CADRE. And without further ado, I'll first introduce Samuel. So Samuel Hansen is the mathematics and statistics librarian at the University of Michigan, who also supports the biostatistics department in the university in the School of Public Health. So their professional interests include bibliometrics, research impact, database design, topic analysis, digital archiving, podcasts. That's why you're seeing his professional gear over there. Network theory, open access, copy theft, science communication, and equity in STEM education. And without further ado, I'll leave the driving seat to Samuel. Please share your slides.
Hey, thank you very much. Oops, that is not what I wanted to share. Let's make sure I actually share the correct slides. There we are. So yes, I'm going to be talking about citation aging, Awoken papers, which you might know from a different name, but I'm going to use the name Awoken papers, and I'm going to talk about some math as well. I'm going to toss a link in the chat right now that has a link to these slides so that you can keep them, do what you will with them. And also, I got a bunch of slides and I'm going to go through a bunch pretty quickly. I do have the chat open. So there's going to be points where I'm, if you see something of interest, just put it in the chat and I will stop and discuss it because otherwise we'll get through maybe half of my slides. So first, let's talk about my question. My question is, how do citations age by discipline? So what are the disciplinary differences? And in particular, I am a person from a math background. I didn't just happen to become a math librarian by accident. That was literally my goal when I went to library school. So I was really interested in how mathematical sciences differ from the aging of other research or from research in the other sciences. But it turns out that like when you write a script to go into a database to grab that, you can kind of just do all of it. And so that's what I did. It's one of those like, oh, I have a script that can do this, so let's just do it for everything instead. So that's why we're not going to talk just about math and science today. And so here are some possible things I thought might be able to answer this. We could look at, say, average citation age by year. Average oldest citation, a percentage citations that are over or under a certain age, a number of Awoken papers, or the ratio of Awoken papers. So those are some options. There's going to be some more that I'm going to toss in here throughout. But first, let's talk a little bit about average citation age. So this is going to take every single year. It will look at every single citation to every single article that was indexed that year, and it will find the median. And in this case, then I averaged those medians across everything, and that gives us these lists of what disciplines have the oldest and what have the youngest. If you notice, we got, math is in there, political science, statistics, probability. So you have some social sciences, some math sciences. And there was a question about Awoken paper. I will get around to the definition of Awoken paper. I won't mention it again until I do define it. So sorry about that. It does have a definition you're probably actually aware of, but I don't like the name that it was given. And I promised myself I would only use that name once. And so then, so we have those over in the oldest and the youngest. I mean, I'm pretty glad that transplantation science doesn't use old citations. I really don't want to have to deal with a transplant that's based off of an article from 1960. That sounds like a really bad idea. Got a lot of medicine. We got some physics in here as well. But you might notice most of the ones with the youngest just haven't been indexed as long. And so clearly there's a little bit of pushback there. And so I'm gonna fly through a few different things here. If anyone sees something they're really surprised by, just put it in the chat and we can discuss it. So I looked at, say, the ones that have only been indexed from 1 year to 29 years. That turns out to be 2 disciplines. Green sustainable science technology, it's been indexed for 1 year. And then cell tissue engineering has been indexed for 25. So really I've decided not to be interested in this segment of index subjects. So for 30 to 59 years, we do see some differences in what's in here. In the oldest now we have some engineering, we got construction, ornithology. Ornithology is an interesting one. Over on the youngest, we still have a bunch of medicine. We still have some physics. We're starting to see like poetry and literature, which I found to be really interesting because a lot of times you might think of the humanities as something that would be willing to go back to the later stuff. Of course, this is Web of Science data. Their coverage on humanities and is probably their least full. to put it that way, and then social sciences, and then the sciences. But so if we jump up to 60 to 89 years, it's starting to see mathematics interdisciplinary application. I'm just going to call out whenever math shows up on any list because I like it so much. We also see like audiology, language pathology, operations research is a very math heavy discipline. We got our transplantation is back. We got nuclear science now. Another good thing, I really don't want anybody building reactors based off what they were doing 60 years ago. And so then we have cell biology. I know we have a biology librarian in the audience, biophysics, but still we're starting to see some pretty similar patterns here. And then the oldest, we've already seen this list. All of those are the top 10 that were up there before. And then in the youngest, we are still looking, I mean, this is almost entirely medical. Actually, I think it is, well, almost entirely medical until we get to biochemistry, molecular biology. And of course, my favorite, the one I've had to practice really hard, let's see if I can get it, otorhinolaryngology, which is going to show up on a lot of lists here. So that's average citation age. So now what if we look at average oldest citation? And so for this, I take the oldest citation for every single article per year and then find the median for that. Here we have some new ones up on the top here, ecology, biodiversity, zoology. So a lot of things that are about sort of taxonomical ideas. And then we still, of course, have math and statistics and some other similar ones. We have a biology that does oldest. Apparently, marine freshwater biology likes to cite old stuff. Over in youngest, again, we see this age difference. So we have literature, we have poetry, cell tissue engineering again, and some other, we have multiple literatures. So literature really is looking like they don't like to continue to do it. And that's why I like the oldest. This is trying to give us a measure of how often like they keep on getting used. So the other one, like that was all of the citation. So if you just have a few papers that keep on getting cited, that can push that one up. Here it's by article, and we're looking at just the oldest. So how often does someone go back and keep on using at least half of these, if you think of the median? And so looking at 30 to 50, yes?
Yeah, good question. So by oldest, you mean oldest in a particular paper that cites?
Yeah, oldest per paper.
Per paper.
So yeah, it's whatever whatever a paper has with oldest.
One more question. Are these categories from Web of Science as well? Web of Science?
Yes, yeah, these are all the Web of Science categories, the 252 main categories. And from Patty, how often is the oldest citation the same citation across articles within the discipline? I don't know. This is heavily aggregated data. I'm looking at millions upon millions of articles, and doing that sort of look would require more computing power than I have, to put it mildly. And so we still have some, this time we actually have some medicine over on the oldest list. We have complementary medicine, emergency medicine. We're looking at a lot of the ones that were on our youngest list already from the total before. So if we look at 60 to 89 years, meteorology, atmospheric sciences, acoustics, we have a physics. Physics has only been over on the youngest before, but atomic molecular chemical seems to keep on reaching back to some of the older ones. And this time we have a material science on the youngest. Apparently, when you're looking at paper and wood, they don't like keeping on reaching back to older things, nor do they like doing it in telecommunications. Which, since we're talking on video, on a video call right now, I mean, maybe that's a good idea. And so our oldest is the same list as from the beginning. And you will recognize almost all of these from the youngest citation, except for there's a couple of educations here. Educational research and education special. So that is interesting. So they don't look back at older papers as often in those. And family studies is the other non-medical. Oh, and industrial relations, labor. I mean, I guess unions were a lot more popular and now they're not. So That could be a little bit. I'm making that up entirely. That just popped into my head. So now, percentage of citations under 30 years. So this is sort of my stand-in for it's related to the oldest, but this time it's a consistent usage over time, and especially if you're looking at ones from percentage under 30 years. So if it's a low number, that means that there's a lot over 30 years. And so that Fewest list looks pretty familiar. I mean, all of these are very interrelated disciplines. We have a few different ones. We have a couple of different literatures in here. Romance hasn't shown up before, and we have women's studies as well, and robotics. But that one only has 35 years. It's not that surprising that there's not too many that are over 30. There's only 5 years they could have come from. So that's why, especially for this one, looking at the different years is pretty important. And so for the oldest, we have a lot of engineering, mining, building, and we have a literature over in the Fewest, and we have multiple literatures in the youngest. A lot of these signals kind of cross each other quite a bit. 60 to 89, got a lot of medicine. It's almost all medicine except for biophysics, which it can be related to medicine at certain times. And also these subjects are not mutually exclusive. So things could be on multiple, like something could be mathematics interdisciplinary applications as well as operations research at the same time. And so a lot of these we have seen before, and then we already saw that other list, and the things over in the most, we've seen most of this, except now we have social work showing up. Might be related to a couple of the educations, or maybe the family studies that we had seen on the average oldest citation. And so this is 30 years. So this is consistent use over time. Whereas this next one, I'm sorry, somebody with a leaf blower is apparently going to start blowing right outside my window. I am sorry. So this is under 5 years. So if it has the fewest, so this is a measure of like instant use. So if it has the most under 5 years, that means that these papers are getting used a lot right away. And so once again, a lot of medicine and poetry. Poetry likes to cite their papers immediately. And so we have social sciences, mathematical methods, statistics, mathematical computational biology, which is good when we have mathematics up there again, a lot of familiar ones. And so physics likes to use recent, so does dance, poetry and dance, some literatures. We have some construction and computer science. We're starting to see computer science a bit more in here. And so that can often, they do show up, they have, computer science has been a very mathematical discipline over its years. And so it's not that surprising to see it in places where you'd also see mathematics. We also have architecture here. So architecture papers are not necessarily cited right away, same with art. So we have acoustic. We're starting to see some animal science and farming in here. I come from a farming background, so that's interesting to me. Those don't get cited immediately. We have biophysics here, which I believe was actually on the most for 30, under 30. So they apparently like citing in the 5 to 30 year range. They're a fan of. So we have transportation science, transportation, transplantology, toxicology, telecommunications again, and then we've already seen all of those most, and we've seen every single one of those from the most list on these other various lists. So there do seem to be some pretty sustainable patterns over different types of aging metrics here that we could really sort of go into the ones that like older work and the ones that like younger work in general. So I also have done some comparisons between mathematics and the other sciences, mathematical sciences and other sciences. I use Web of Science journal level subjects to combine them into aggregate subjects. So mathematics, chemistry, physics, biology, and astronomy. They're not mutually exclusive. Articles could count in multiple subjects. And so mathematics is mathematics, interdisciplinary applications applied, and statistics probability. Chemistry is chemistry medicinal, organic, analytic, or analytical, multidisciplinary, physical, electrochemistry, applied, and then inorganic and nuclear. Physics is thermodynamics, optics, physics, nuclear, condensed matter, multidisciplinary, atomic, molecular, and chemical. Particle and fields, fluids and plasmas, applied, and mathematical. Biology is cell biology, and this one was the hardest for me, I will admit. Scott, I know you're listening. Sorry, I didn't reach out. I should have. Cell biology, biochemistry and molecular biology, reproductive biology, biophysics, math, and comp bio, just plain old biology, microbiology, developmental biology, and evolutionary biology. And astronomy was astronomy and astrophysics. Just one subject. There's only one. So looking at these I can actually show you graphs. The other ones, there's 252 things, a few too many things for a graph. So here I can show you graphs. These are the total number of articles. So you notice physics leads for a bit, then chemistry pops up above it, biology in the middle, then math, and then astronomy on the bottom. Get a similar thing for the number of articles that have citations. Because that's what we are looking at, except math seems to maybe start decreasing sooner, which would make sense as they cite later. And then this is a graph of the percentage of these papers with citations. So that other one was just raw citation counts. This is the percentage of citations. So math definitely starts decreasing more quickly here. There's also a real difference between pre-1940 and post-1966, which was when the publication boom started happening. Pre-1940, chemistry is generally the highest, followed by physics, bio, math, and then finally astronomy. Post-1966, biology's ratio jumps to the top, and then it's followed by astronomy and chemistry, then physics, and finally mathematics, which is noticeably lower, by like 5 to 10% lower. In fact, if you sum up all the percentages, math ends up with the lowest, and chemistry ends up with the highest in the end, if you sum up year to year. So then this is the median citation age. So this is over time, year by year. Look who's generally on top, all except like 7 years. Math is the highest. And then starting in 1960, the mathematical disciplines start to converge. They're within 2 to 4 years of each other in general. And then mathematics doesn't get within 4 years of the others until 1995. So that's, 30 years or so where math is just noticeably older than the others by a significant amount. I mean, it's always noticeably older than biology. And this is the total amount of citations. This is actually if you start taking the median per article and then the median of all of the articles. And we notice something very interesting here. So chemistry before, which was solidly second youngest, all of a sudden jumps or stays further up, and physics just drops way down. The thing that made the most sense for me here is that that likely means that there's a few articles in physics, and by a few, this could be thousands of articles, but there's a small number of articles in physics which drive a large number of the older citations in physics. Because if we look at the median citation per article median, it drops way down, which means that some number of articles must be getting a large number of older citations to skew the overall total citation median a lot higher than this. Math is still the oldest. So this is median oldest citation age. So this is another one where you see physics lower than chemistry and closer down to biology. So it's another possible showing of what I talked about before. And this is interesting, but what I really like to look at is if we take this and then actually replace it with the year that oldest citation happened. And so on the y-axis is the year. If you look at math and astronomy, the orange and the blue over on the far side, that's around 2005, 2010. So for articles published in 1900 that are indexed in Web of Science with at least one citation, if they are mathematics or astronomy, at least half of them have been cited since 2005. If they are physics, 1973, 1979 for chemistry, 1967 for biology. And that is nearly a 50-year difference for the half of the papers have been cited since. And for me, the truly incredible thing of this is just pretty much how flat math's oldest citation year curve is. It's really quite flat. There's only 6 years where the oldest citation is 2005 or below, and the earliest is only 2001. Astro is close, but it has a lot more variability. There's a lot more up and down, and it has more slope. The others do not even get close to the year 2000 for their oldest citation median year until 1950s for chemistry and physics and 1960s for biology. That's 50 years until it is where math and astronomy are in 1900. So I find that to be a really interesting way of looking at this data. And then for over 5 years, subjects are mostly above 80% until the 1990s. Biology starts to drop around, it gets below that in, it's not 1990s, it is the 1960s, sorry. Biology starts to drop in 44, chemistry, physics, astronomy, 1960. Mathematics is above 90% being older than 5 years until the 60s. And there's a plateau overall around 60% for most things that starts to, from the 70s and 90s, and then it starts to drop. Math doesn't drop below 90s until the mid 1990s. And then it starts to drop with the rest. So non-immediate use is much more prevalent in mathematical work, just much more prevalent, especially post the publication boom that followed World War II. So it's just much more prevalent. And then this is 15 years. You get a similar set of plateau and descent behaviors. There's a bit more noise, a little bit less convergence. Mathematics seem to have an even larger cushion, and biology also has some separation on the bottom. And then for citations over 30 years, there's much less to almost no plateauing for some disciplines. Biology maintains the lowest, mathematics the highest. I think it's really interesting to note for this set of data that the first time the percentage of citations over 30 years old drops, and so this is over 30 years instead of under 30 years. It's the inverse of the previous. The first time it drops below 50% for mathematics is 1965. And so for other disciplines, it was 46 for physics and astronomy, 41 for chemistry, 1912 for biology. Mathematics consistently relies on older work. Just it's very, very stark, the reliance on older work in comparison with these other subjects. So now, Awoken papers, and now I will define Awoken papers. What this presentation calls an Awoken paper are referred to in the majority of the literature as sleeping beauties. This presentation is going to eschew the use of this nomenclature due to the gendered and patriarchal implications inherent in this name, as well as the Eurocentric nature of its use as a reference which excludes the majority of people in this world. I have real problems with that name. I'm simply not going to use it. Awoken papers and the other name that I won't use are essentially papers that receive very few citations for a long period of time, and then you see a spike in citations. So they were asleep and then they awoke. I drew a citation graph of one on the whiteboard behind me, which is probably really, really small on your screen. It is for one I actually found that had the third highest coefficient of anything else, a coefficient I'm about to talk about. I use the coefficient method for determining Awoken papers. This method was created by Key, Ferrara, Radici, and Flamini. It was published in the publications of the National Academies of Sciences. And it's essentially the measurement of the difference between a linear growth, so if citations grew linearly, and the to the peak of the citation count and the actual number of citations per year. So if you have one, if you think of this as the linear growth, if you have one that dips really far down, you end up with a large gap in between them. And so that would give you a large coefficient. If it's about where it is, it would give you a small one. And if it actually ends up going above, and so almost like logarithmic growth, that would give you a negative one. And so it's really close to a integral. It's the difference between two curves. And so what you do is you calculate this coefficient for all of the papers, and then you just define the top 0.1% of coefficient scores as being Awoken papers. So it's just saying we are going to define 0.1% as Awoken papers. That is just the number that they used in that paper, and I also decided to use in this. It means that I do get different coefficient numbers to get the Awoken papers than they did, because I work with a slightly different data set. They were looking at 1900 to 2014 Web of Science, and I'm looking at 1900 to 2017. When I measured these, I measured them in a couple of ways. They looked at just the raw count in their paper, which I wondered a bit about, because each discipline has a different number of papers indexed. And so I wanted to normalize it for that. So I also looked at AP ratios, which is the number of Awoken papers divided by the total number of articles. It's the most simple normalization that you can do. And so for that, that means the top 10 Awoken paper creating disciplines. Sorry, there's just going to be a lot of tables here. There's been a lot of text on a lot of my slides, and I'm sorry. So on the left-hand side, these are the top disciplines by cited article count. So this is just the ones with the most papers, most articles. The next one over is the top disciplines that were found in the original paper. The column after that is the top disciplines by raw count that I found, which you will find is very similar to the list that they found, with the exception that surgery dropped off of my top list here. And these aren't even top 10, are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, these are top 7. That was what was listed in their paper. So there's 7 here. So most of these are pretty much the same, except chemistry, physical jumped up on mine, and surgery dropped down. I think surgery is number 8 on my list, to be honest. And then on the one on the far right, those are Awoken paper ratios. And so this is where we start to see some real differences, because there's only 2 that are in the top 7 of the Awoken paper ratios that are in the top lists of the counts. That is mathematics and physics multidisciplinary. Physics multidisciplinary is actually higher in both the ratio as well as it being the top count getter, period. And none of those are in the list with the most papers. So the ones that have the most papers overall, like you see, chemistry multidisciplinary has the second most paper overall, also the second most APs by raw count, but it's not in the ratio list. So there are some real differences if you start looking at the amount, if you look at a normalized version of Awoken papers. So here I actually put in the article counts and the ratios. And remember, these our expected value here is 0.1%. Like that is what we multiply. That's the amount that we took from the entire corpus. So calculated that coefficient for every single cited article, took the top 0.1% of those. So if these were going to be distributed randomly across disciplines, which of course they're not. If they were, we would expect 0.1% here. Whereas social sciences mathematical methods, it gets nearly 5 times that. That's a lot more than if they were random. And I mean, mathematics is also 0.39. Statistics probability is 0.45. The lowest on our list here is psychology psychoanalysis with 0.3. And then you see the other ones like the amount that they actually generate. So physics multidisciplinary generates 2,711, and it's 0.4%. And so you can also see those the article counts for the other ones. They aren't the same disciplines, of course. If anyone wants those, I have tons of spreadsheets with all of this data. So then if we look at the top AP creating disciplines, so for disciplines in the top 30 by article count, so this is just the total top 30 article count, 16 of those are also in the top 30 of the raw count for Awoken papers. So there's clearly some relationship there. So if you have a lot of papers published, you might have a lot of Awoken papers. Only 4 of those 30 are in the top 30 by largest Awoken paper ratio, though. So the 2 that we already knew, physics, multidisciplinary mathematics, and then multidisciplinary sciences and chemistry multidisciplinary. One of the findings of that original paper was that interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity does seem to generate a larger number of Awoken papers. So that does seem to hold here as well. And I have more examples of that later. And so then we've already looked at some of those, but let's look at this last sort of pairing here. So for disciplines in the top 30 by total raw count, 10 of those are in the largest AP ratio count. So that's less of a relationship than the raw count of articles and raw count of APs had. There still seems to be some. We've seen a few of these, and then statistics is in there, psychology multidisciplinary, so another multidisciplinary, just plain old psychology, economics, biology, and metallurgy and metallurgical engineering. Just one I haven't had a chance. I've been able to say the name of a lot of subjects so far today. I haven't been able to say that one, so good. And so next up, I have some correlations between these data sets. So we do have a semi-decent positive correlation between number of paper and the raw count of Awoken papers at 0.64. There is effectively no correlation between the total number of papers and the ratio. Those two things are not very closely related. 0.06, that is a very, very weak correlation. And we have a moderate correlation of around 53% between the raw count and the ratio. So there is some relationship there. It's a positive relationship, but it's not super, super strong. So then I had another question, and that is, are papers with higher number of citations? So if I take slices of this data and look at just papers with higher number of citations, are they more likely to be Awoken papers? And are there disciplinary differences here? And so the answer to that is yes. Now, this should be relatively obvious in that a article with only 1 citation, even if it was published in 1990 and that citation happened in 2017, there's not going to be a big enough gap in there to create a very large coefficient. So you need some decent amount of citation. So it's definitely going to be more likely, but some of these we get some pretty large orders of magnitude differences here that might not necessarily be as obvious, and it becomes really interesting looking at the disciplinary differences here. So if you look at just those with 25 citations, you get 0.35. So that's still less than social sciences mathematical methods, just as like a subject with all papers. But for 100 citations, we've now increased an order of magnitude. And then if we look at 300 citations, we double that, and then we get up to 3.489% if you look at only papers with 500 citations. So that's 3 out of every 100 papers that have at least 500 citations could also be considered an Awoken paper. So comparing disciplines here, and so I have to put in some caveats about how I explored these. In order to do this, once you start limiting the number of citations, you start to get outlier disciplines really quickly, because there's just some disciplines that don't generate many citations. And so I looked at certain percentages in order to toss out ones that just generated a very small number, because that threw my numbers off incredibly. So for 25 citations, I wanted at least 9% of the publications total in the discipline to have it in. For 100 citations, at least 0.109, that's 80th percentile. For 300 citations, at least 0.117% of publications. I'm not asking for a huge percentage here. But like once we get at that, almost all of them had like 1 paper. or a large, not almost all of them, but of the ones that I threw out, a lot of them had 1, 2, or 3 papers. And so if one of those is Awoken, you don't really have a pattern because 1 out of 3 is fine, but it gets a really high percentage number. And then 0.042 for 500 citations. And so this is the top 10 list for all of them. And these are ratios. These are for the ratios. I don't know if you can notice a pattern for what comes number 1. It's mathematics. Look at that, just across the board. And I did not specifically choose those percentiles to make this happen. It was, even without tossing anything out, math was usually in like the top 5 interspersed with disciplines that had like 1 paper on these. And then we have statistics and probability is second, and then it shows up in all 4. So math is strong in here. So inter and multidisciplinary again seem to be a large driver. Physics multidisciplinary is in 25, 100. Social sciences interdisciplinary is 100, 300, 500. Mathematics applied, which is also interdisciplinary, is 100, 300. Engineering multidisciplinary, 300, 500. Social sciences and engineering are huge in here. And we have social science mathematical methods, psychology, mathematical, social sciences, interdisciplinary, psychology, psychoanalysis, and then metallurgy, engineering, multidisciplinary, engineering, anthropology, aerospace. Anthropology should have been on the other list, as should sociology, engineering, geological, and mining and mineral processing. But really the strongest driver here seems to be mathematical techniques. The 4 disciplines which appear in all top 4 all are math. Mathematics, social sciences, mathematical methods, statistics and probability, and psychology, mathematical. Those are the 4 that are in all of these lists. Mathematics applied shows up in a couple. Operations, research, and management science is also present. Those are both, of course, very heavily mathematical as well. So math really does seem to just be a massive driver for this sort of citation behavior. And so I want to give a word for mathematics here. So this is the highest citation ratio for all citation counts. For 25, it's 3.4%. For 100, it's 11.6. 300, it's 22.7, and 500 is 26.2. And I also have the second highest ratios. For 25, it's half again larger, so 3.4 versus 2.1. For 100, it's almost twice as large, 11.6 versus 6.6. The ratios become a bit closer for 300, 22.7 versus 16.2, and 500 is 26.2 versus 22. But the next closest in both of those cases had a significantly smaller population of articles. There's 819 math articles with at least 300 citations, and the next highest only had 166. And then for 500, there's 286 versus 91. So if we go, the same's the next few. For 300, after 166, we get a discipline with 34 and one with 149. And then the one below that is the first one that's as large or larger than math with 1,837 citations. And that one was about half of what math was at 11.7%. For 500, after the one that has 91, we have one with 96, one with 57, and then finally one with 245, which is at least close to math. And that one only has 17.5. So again, really far away from math is 26.2. So the high occurrence of sleepers throughout, it's likely tied to the proof-based nature of modern academic mathematical knowledge. The way that math is done means that old articles, they don't lose their relevance or correctness as they age. Their old articles are just as legitimate to cite as new ones. In a way that, say, to bring up one that I mentioned earlier, transplant science. Like, there is a real difference between how knowledge in those two disciplines work and move forward. With mathematics, once something is proven, as long as you're in the same axiomatic system, given modern mathematics, it will continue to be true for everyone else using that axiomatic system as long as the proof is correct. So the number of sleepers is just a higher percentage of all possible articles in mathematics. There's just more sleeping there than other disciplines. And so that creates a perfect environment for the creation of sleepers with modern mathematicians who are now more able to find theorems which were published well ahead of their time. We have better search now. We have better access and ability to find these older papers. And then once they're found, once one person cites them, if it's an important enough paper, that can spawn a bunch of more people citing that older article. I mean, it's just the way citation behavior tends to work. And so there's just more weighting there. And so it can help prove new results that way. And so finally, I'm going to close out here with a few correlations. I know we flew through this. I want to leave some time for questions. So the AP ratio to, so the overall ratio to at least 25 citations is pretty low. There's not that much. Like once you bump up to 25 citations, there's not much relationship there. It gets a little bit better between 25 and 50. So we're looking at 9.19. But so there's 25 to 50, but 50 to 100, those are decently correlated. We have a 0.66. But 100 to 300 are highly correlated, like 0.81. So there's not much change between sort of the way the disciplines effectively order themselves here, between 100 and 300, but 300 to 500 goes back down. Not entirely sure what is happening here. So if anyone has any ideas, I'd more than welcome hearing them. But also really interesting, there's more correlation between the overall and the 100 than there is between the overall and the 25. So actually bumping up to a higher number of citations actually gives us a higher correlation. So that 0.13 between overall and 25, and then that other one from 25 to 50, I think that those together just sort of end up getting us to the 100. So Patty sent in a chat, do some fields have journals that impose limits on references more often than others? Or have lower limits on the number of references allowed when they do have limits? Those are incredibly interesting questions that, again, are sort of out of scope of what I am doing here. One of the things I kind of want to do with this work, which hopefully will lead to questions like that being answered, because I really do think that that is an interesting question, is once I have this, once I finally, finish writing this up and get my first publication out about these things, I am planning on sharing my data. And so people from other disciplines who have a similar like disciplinary focus that I have to mathematics, who can speak really to the behavior of disciplines. Because to me, that's a really interesting thing. It's something you kind of have to be a part of. It's not something like I will never understand chemistry in the way that our chemistry librarian, who's also a CADRE fellow, Yulia, who is also, I think, a part of our in the audience for this webinar. I will never understand chemistry's behavior in the way that Yulia can, as a chemist and a chemistry librarian, and I can understand math better as a mathematician and a math librarian, and so. Like, I do want to let other people have access. I mean, I can't give them access to all of the raw data. That is CADRE's job. But the data that I've done the analysis and aggregation on, I do have every intention of sharing. And so other people will not necessarily have to go through the long computational cycles that I have. And hopefully we'll be able to answer some questions like that one. And so with that being said, I also welcome a lot of other questions. I will once again put a link to the slides in the chat.
Fascinating presentation. Thank you, Sam, for this. I just want to quickly comment on your idea of sharing the data. That's what CADRE is built on. We would like to work with you if you really want to make that possible on our platform. Not everybody have access to websites, but at least those who is part of the consortium will have, the capability to see your data. So I think that's
well, and if I understand correctly, aggregate analyses, say like the ones that I generated into spreadsheets for a lot of this, those I believe can be shared with everyone because that's a final part of data analysis.
I believe so. We will definitely, we don't have a set policy yet, but I believe so. We will work that out. All right, we have time for several questions. Please unmute yourself if you have a question. Well, give a little time for others to think about their question. I have one.
Sure.
So you mentioned the sort of Awoken paper seem to be more prevalent in mathematical disciplines because the way they cite older papers, proven theorems. But I think the definition of Awoken papers really is about the concave or convex shape of the citation plots, right?
Yes.
So it's not simply just citing old papers will lead to a bigger coefficient. So I think partially explain this because of the boom in recent years, people start to finding old papers. But do you think there's also I think a large part of that is also can be explained by more papers appeared recently, and will naturally lead to sort of more concave shape. Is that the case?
I mean, I do think that is part of the reason why. I mean, part of it, but there are Awoken papers that happened before all of that. Like there are papers that awoke in the 50s and the 60s as well, that were published 30, 40 years before that. So this is something that has happened just generally over time. And so you are right that you do need that concave structure. But like with math, you can just have papers that, get 1 or 2 citations or somewhere between 0 and 2 citations max, for just a long period of time until someone figures out that, oh, that's what's important. I mean, think of some of the prime, like, I don't believe that this actually generated an Awoken paper, but I mean, some very important results in mathematics, such as the work that G.H. Hardy did with prime numbers. People recognize that as an important and useful work, but it did not actually start to see its real time in the sun until public key cryptography. Like that's when all of a sudden. So a lot of times, and I think this is why interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work tends to get it, is a lot of times it in mathematics, it can also be that you have it happening within discipline, but a lot of times it can happen from outside of discipline too. Or like with computer science at that point, you could argue was effectively a mathematical discipline. So there are some of it is just the behavior of mathematicians, and also just like the math just doesn't get a lot of citations in general. And so when you have a paper that gets a bunch, it's just as likely, it seems, to happen later as it is sooner. And so it's just going to generate more, once it starts to get citations, it's just more likely to end up making it an Awoken paper because it's just as likely that it was. If we think back to the over under like the 5-year, 30-year, it seems just as likely to be over 30 years as it was under 5 years. And so there is some of that disciplinary behavior.
Thank you. So I saw Yulia has a question.
Yeah. So Yulia's question, when you talk about differences and trends between those disciplines, do you count for statistical errors and whether those differences are statistically significant? I have not done measures of statistical significance. In some of the Awoken paper ones, I kind of didn't, because the numbers are so large. When it's generating twice as many, I didn't really feel the necessary need to test for statistical significance there. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by statistical errors. So I'm actually when we're doing this isn't like it isn't really looking at, say, a subset of a population. Like we're actually doing this is a survey. Like, this is the entire population. We're looking at all of the data. And so I'm not entirely sure if there should be statistical errors in that case. My statistics is much worse than my mathematics.
All right, we still have time for maybe one more question.
Yes, thank you, Julia. Yes, we can definitely talk later about this.
Well, I guess I have one more question. Because one potential explanation of this concave shape I can think is, I think, your intuition of people seeing other people citing an old paper, and they follow sort of the citation link, the cascades, to dig those up. So is there any way, like, do you have plans to sort of to verify that hypothesis? I can potentially seeing sort of look at citation in multiple steps and see how those actually happened.
There has been some existing work on that. So I was relying somewhat on other people's already existing work. So and thank you, Anya, and the new term. Part of the reason that I'm so strongly against the SB term was that some people had done some analysis, and they decided to call the paper that awoke the paper the Prince Charming paper. And I was already like I was already like, SB's like, I don't like that. But no, like that was, and so there is existing analysis. You can find it by searching the term that I just said. And so there have been some people who have tried to do that, and they try to identify the very, very specific paper, and at the very least, the coefficient one does a pretty good job of defining the year that it awoke. So where that slope really changes, and so at the very least, you can sort of go there, because a lot of times I think it's kind of hard to find the specific paper. You end up with a lot of sort of like how you have the mutual simultaneous discovery, in things. And so you can, so I think that you have similar things, like a discipline just sort of keeps on going, and then they find the paper that unlocks, the work for a bunch of people.
I see. Yeah, there's more reason for you to publish papers, give a better name, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Oh. Yes, Patty. The higher math SB or the Awoken papers. It's just, the application area came along later. That's a big reason for ones that you can find in math. So account for the general growth of citations as we have more journals. As I said, I took the measure. So for the ones where you're looking at like citation age and all of that, no, just because like when I take percentages and things, because some of them are normalized, some are not. When they're normalized, that will account for the growth of citations as we have more journals. For the ones that are not normalized at all, they just won't. But that's part of the reason I'm at least trying to use medians. But thankfully, most of them, since I'm looking year by year, most of the journal growth, actually, like the publication boom, like it happens pretty uniformly across disciplines. at least if they were indexed in Web of Science at that time. So there is just that year-to-year indexing issue that can be problematic, which is why I tried looking at them in chunks instead of looking at them all together, because those ones that are 100, like indexed for 118 years, something that's indexed for 25 years, like those things are not really going to be comparable. So yes. Yeah,
All
math
right.
is definitely an area that is cited by applied areas. Like math is that nice thing in that it also happens to lay the foundation for a lot of other things. And so when something's the foundation, it's just going to be found later. Like it has to already be there. So yeah, with that sort of relationship with other applied areas. Yeah, because like things build on top of math. And so if the math isn't there yet, it is really hard to like build something on top of it, which is what has to happen a lot of the time. My hope for initial publications out of this are going to be a couple of general, so one about the general citation aging stuff, one about the general Awoken paper stuff that sort of talks about everything in general, and then I'm going to publish a deep dive, like really into math. I'm really like just going to dig into math. And I'm very excited about that. Like, I can't wait to get the general stuff out so that I can just nerd out entirely.
Looking forward to that for sure. Thank you again, Samuel. We're out of time, but wonderful presentations. Hopefully we'll
thank you.
hear from you again once you have the deep dive.
Yes. And thank CADRE so much. Without y'all, this wouldn't be possible.
Thanks everyone for attending. We hope to see you in our next webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you.